In this video, we're going to go over an approach to clinical practice and measurement called goal attainment scaling. Real research, what people think of as real research, randomized controlled trials, tends to feel irrelevant to clinicians, right? It's not what they're going to implement in their practice. Uh, Research for randomized controlled trials and the kinds of research we talk about in evidence-based practice tends to require a lot of people. I mean, even a small N design requires 3 to 5 people. And you need some sort of control group, right? You need people that aren't going to get your intervention, which isn't natural in a clinical setting. Uh, and then everybody gets measured on the exact same scale so that we can compare the results. But in clinical practice, we create goals for each individual person and we don't measure everyone on the same scale usually. Um, and then finally, this idea of statistical significance is not the same as clinical significance. So the fact that something creates a statistically significant difference isn't the point in clinical interventions. It's to create clinically significant differences. Goal attainment scaling was developed by psychologists originally to address some of these problems, to allow them to study the outcomes of their interventions and in a way that's specific to each of their individual clients. So in goal attainment scaling, we establish a goal for each client. We define a measure for that goal for that client, and then we define a scale for that client that defines success, which is very much closer to how we think of clinical practice. So the goals are SMART goals, the same kind we've been teaching you in OT. So they're specific to the client and specific to the actual behaviors we're interested in, measurable, so they need to be not necessarily quantifiable, but they need to be something you can either measure or categorize as a success or failure, acceptable to the client, acceptable to you, relevant to the client, and time related, which means time constrained. So you're going to say within 4 months or by the end of the treatment or by the end of the semester. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the end of treatment, but it does need to be time constrained. And you're going to specifically design these goals for realistic expectations, right? So what you realistically expect the client to achieve. Uh, and what we know from goal attainment scaling is that these goals are more likely to be attained if the patient is involved in selecting them, which is true of clinical practice as well. So the kinds of things that will go into your measure are what the things that are relevant to your client and their goal and their behavior, right? So your measure may focus on what types of supports they need, right? So what other people have to help them, what kinds of physical aids are involved in the task, what level of assistance or independence they have achieved. You can also quantify performance. So how long does the performance take? How far do they do something like travel? How often do they do something? So frequency, how many of something did they do? A quantity. Any of these can become part of the measure that you establish. Building the scale, you start with the baseline. That's scored at -2. That's where the client currently is before treatment starts using your measure. The expected level is 0. So where you realistically expect your client to get to based on your treatment. And then the best possible outcome is +2. So that's the most you could realistically expect your client to achieve. And clearly, goal attainment scaling is ripe for abuse, right? So if you consistently establish expected levels that are easy to achieve and best possible outcomes that are easy to achieve, then your goal attainment scaling is not going to be worth a whole lot. But if you use it actually, if you take it seriously and establish realistic expected levels and best possible outcome levels, then this actually does work. These intermediate levels, the better outcome and progression towards the goal, these can be a challenge to define. So the way that I recommend approaching this is to use the 3 milestone technique. So you can easily establish where they are now, the -2. You can establish where you expect them to be, and you can establish the best possible outcome you can imagine for them. And then these become intermediate levels where they're just somewhere in between, right? So they have improved, but they haven't reached expected level. That's -1. They did exceed your expectations, but there's still room for improvement. That's +1.